This is the second of 3 videos dealing with the subject of bat mitzvah, but the subject of bat mitzvah in each of these 3 videos is really only a springboard for dealing with a larger issue of the status of women in Judaism. So in the first video, I examined a principle, a Talmudic principle. It's a Talmudic legal principle in which women are exempt from all positive time-bound commandments. Positive commandments that we're required to do and time-bound that we're required to do at a certain time. And women are exempt from positive time-bound commandments. Now this principle then, Talmudic principle, reflects a clear discrimination, distinction between men and women in Jewish law. And the question that I examine then is whether such a distinction in the Jewish law, discrimination, constitutes discrimination to the detriment of women. And I argued in that first video that in my personal view, the principle does not constitute discrimination to the detriment of women. Why? Because according to the principle, women are not prohibited from doing anything. Women are simply exempt from positive time-bound commandments. They're not required to do them. I also suggested that the principle may have reflected an ancient Talmudic ideal. This is a Talmudic ideal, not a biblical ideal. A Talmudic ideal that the place of the woman was to be in the home. And I also argued that in my personal view, such a Talmudic ideal that the place of the woman is to be in the home does not constitute discrimination to the detriment of women in Judaism, because such a Talmudic ideal is simply that, an ideal. So that even for those of us who may not identify with such an ideal, Talmudic ideal, that the place of the woman is in the home, in any case, in practice, in the Talmudic tradition, in practice, the woman is free to work outside the home if that's what she wanted. So therefore, in practice, I don't think there was any, the ideal doesn't in practice reflect any discrimination to the detriment of women. So that's what I discussed in the first video. So in these next 2 videos, I want to directly address the larger issue of the status of women in Judaism, in terms of legal status, social status. So, but before I do that, I want to say 2 things by way of general background. Number 1, I very much identify with my Orthodox background and Orthodox lifestyle. I do not identify with an Orthodox conception of Judaism. The term Orthodox is a Latin term, an influence of Christianity. It literally means correct belief, correct doctrine. And if we return to our roots, the ancient Jewish tradition based upon the Hebrew Bible and the Talmudic literature, then the nature of traditional Judaism, if for some reason we're insisting on using Latin terms, the nature of traditional Judaism is orthoprax, correct practice, correct deeds. And traditional Judaism, based on the Bible and the Talmud, has a very pragmatic orientation. And I also want to add that I think widespread is a misconception that Judaism has always been orthodox. In my mind, this is completely not true. Traditional Judaism, again, traditional Judaism based on the Hebrew Bible, the Talmudic literature, is orthoprax. And orthodoxy represents a later historical development following the Talmudic period, representing an influence of Christianity. So I do not identify with an Orthodox conception of Judaism from a philosophic point of view. I very much identify with my background from a social point, my Orthodox background from a social point of view. I belong, from a social point of view, I belong to what would be called the modern Orthodox world, not ultra-Orthodox world. And, but I very much identify with my Orthodox background and lifestyle. And the reason that I say that I want to emphasize, that I so identify with my Orthodox background and Orthodox lifestyle, is that in these 2 videos I will voice criticism of the Orthodox world and I want to emphasize then that I intend such criticism to be of a constructive nature, constructive criticism. So that's point number one. Point number two, by way of general background, I am not a rabbi, I'm not ordained as a rabbi, I'm a teacher of Jewish studies. And in not having rabbinic ordination, that means that I am not authorized to teach practical matters, practical law, matters of permissible and forbidden. So in dealing with legal issues, not just in these two videos, also in terms of these two videos, but in general as a teacher of Jewish studies, in dealing with legal issues, I'm not dealing with legal issues from a strict legal point of view, certainly not in terms of practical law of what is permissible and forbidden or teaching people. My intention is not to teach people how to act permissible and forbidden. In dealing with legal issues as a teacher of Jewish studies and in these two videos, I'm dealing with legal issues only from a philosophic point of view. My purpose as a teacher, especially in these two videos, my purpose as a teacher in addressing the issue of the status of women in Judaism and Jewish law, my purpose is not to teach practical law, permissible, forbidden, or to teach people how to act in terms of permissible and forbidden. My purpose is simply to stimulate thinking, to cause people to think and examine the issues and to hopefully stimulate to further discussion of the issues. Okay, so that's by way of general background. So now in terms of these next two videos, I'm going to then address the larger issue, now in a more direct way, the larger issue of the status of women in Judaism. And I want to begin by revealing my direction that I will argue here in these two videos that in my personal view, there's very clearly discrimination to the detriment of women in Judaism, and very clearly within Jewish law, in my view, very clearly women have an inferior status. Okay, so I'm going to begin by citing two Talmudic sources that I think very clearly imply that women have an inferior status to that of men within Jewish law. So the first source is from the Babylonian Talmud, Menachot 43b. And before I cite the source, let me just give a little background to the source. In traditional Judaism, prior to the morning prayer service, a traditional Jew gets up in the morning and makes blessings, morning blessings. A number of these blessings that a traditional Jew makes upon arising in the morning. And among them, there are three blessings that a Jewish male makes. And these blessings are each formulated in the negative, where the Jewish male blesses God for not having made me a non-Jew, for not having made me a slave, and for not having made me a woman. And for me personally, I find the negative formulation regarding all three of the blessings to be insulting. So in a yeshiva in which I studied, a yeshiva study academy, an Orthodox yeshiva in which I studied here in Israel, the head of the yeshiva, the rabbi, cited a precedent in the Middle Ages of Jews who, for those who have difficulty with these three blessings, as in my case, he cited a precedent in the Middle Ages of Jews who recited only one blessing of a positive nature. We're thanking God for having made me a Jew. In Hebrew, She'asani Yisrael, for having made me a member of the people Israel, for having made me a Jew. And actually, and that's my personal practice, is I make this one blessing and not the three blessings. I make one blessing thanking God for having made me a Jew, but this one blessing, thanking God for having made me a Jew, actually appears in the Talmudic source that I'm going to cite, and so that it also has Talmudic precedent. But in this Talmudic source, Rabbi Acha Bar Yaakov, a great Talmudic rabbi, is having a discussion with his son, and the son says, why should he bless for having not made him a slave? Slave is the same as a woman, he says. And so notice, he acknowledges explicitly that the status of a woman is that of a slave is that of a woman. He acknowledges that women have an inferior status to Jewish free men. So Rabbi Acha Bar Yaakov answers his son. He says, no, the status of women is better than that of slaves. But notice then that even according to the response of Rabbi Acha Bar Yaakov, very clearly implied is acknowledgement that the status of women is inferior in relation to that of Jewish free men. Her status is better than that of slaves, according to Rabbi Acha Bar Yaakov, but it's inferior to that of Jewish free men. That's the first source, Talmudic source, that I want to cite in this regard. The second source that I want to cite is from the tractate of Kiddushin. Kiddushin, from the word kadosh, means holy, sacred. Kiddushin is the rabbinic term for marriage, and literally means sanctification. That marriage is seen as something very sacred in Judaism. And so the rabbinic term for marriage is Kiddushin, sanctification. The Talmudic literature, there's actually two Talmuds, a Babylonian and a Jerusalem. Each of them are volumes of material, commentaries upon one work that's of a short legal work, and the main legal work called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah has both legal material that we call halakha, law, and non-legal material that we call agadah, moral, spiritual teaching. So it has both, but it's in the main a legal work. And it's a short work that's the foundation of the Jewish tradition from a legal point of view. And both Talmuds, the Babylonian and Jerusalem, are commentaries, volumes of material that are commentaries upon the one work of the Mishnah. So in the Mishnah, in the tractate of Kiddushin, dealing with matters of marriage, the first chapter, there are the first 5 teachings of the first chapter deal with the subject of acquisition. And the first teaching is the acquisition of a woman in marriage. The second teaching is the acquisition of Hebrew slaves, Jewish slaves. The third teaching is the acquisition of Canaanite slaves, non-Jewish slaves. The fourth teaching is the acquisition of animals. And then the fifth teaching is the acquisition of property. So we see very clearly that the woman, in being acquired in marriage, is not to be treated as property. She's not to be regarded as property of the husband, because very clearly you see a hierarchy here in which women are at the top of the hierarchy, followed by below the status of women is that of slaves, then animals, and then property. So her status is not that of property. She's not property of her husband. However, clearly implied in these teachings is that the status of women is inferior to that of Jewish free men. Conspicuously absent here from the hierarchy, conspicuously absent are Jewish free men, because it's Jewish free men who are doing the acquiring of all these things, women, slaves, animals, property. So that there's very clearly here, women have an inferior status to that of Jewish free men. And just not only that, but in terms of marriage, it's the man, the Jewish free man, who's acquiring the woman in marriage. It's not a mutual acquisition of a man acquiring a woman and a woman acquiring a man together, that they acquire each other. It's not mutual. It very clearly reflects an inequality. It's the man who is acquiring the woman. Okay, so that's in terms of status of women in Jewish law. What I want to do in the remainder of this video is I want to address 2 issues dealing with discrimination to the detriment of women. The first issue that I want to deal with is divorce. So 2 aspects to the issue of divorce. First, that a woman can be divorced against her will, even without her consent, according to Talmudic law. And second, that it's the man who initiates the divorce and has to give a divorce document, and the woman does not initiate divorce. Okay, so first, the first aspect, that the woman can be divorced against her will. So parenthetically, there was a decree given in the early Middle Ages, given by Rabbeinu Gershom, who was a great halachic legal scholar, and he gave an edict, a decree, that the divorce does require the consent of the woman, that she cannot be divorced against her will. But that edict applied only in what we call the Ashkenazi world. There are different subcultures from an ethnic point of view in Judaism. That the two main subcultures are Ashkenazi and Mizrahi. Ashkenazi refers to Jews from Christian Europe, and the Mizrahi subculture refers to Jews from the Arabic Islamic world. There were other subcultures, but these are the two main ones. And Rabbeinu Gershom's edict applied only in the Ashkenazi world. But in any case, if we go back to the Talmud, prior to Rabbeinu Gershom's decree, the Talmudic law is that the man can divorce the woman against her will, even without her consent. So that very clearly represented a problem in that, remember that according to the Talmudic ideal, the woman was to be in the home. So in practice, in the Talmudic world, women generally did not work outside the home. They generally weren't taught. They didn't have a profession. So that the woman, in leaving the home of her parents and marrying, was in a very precarious position if she could be divorced against her will and be left without a profession, without a way of supporting herself. So the rabbis here, the Talmudic rabbis, I think widespread in the Orthodox world, again I mean this as constructive criticism, but widespread is this kind of rationalization when there are inequalities, injustices, particularly regarding the relations of men and women, that these are not inequalities, they're not injustices, they're simply differing functions that men and women have. Within Jewish law, within the Jewish tradition, that the men and women have differing functions, but there is not inequality or discrimination to the detriment of women. And I think such rationalization is simply not faithful to the Talmudic tradition. It's certainly not faithful to Rabbi Yacha Bar Yaakov, who acknowledges, I think, very clearly and implicitly that the status of women is better than that of a slave, but inferior to Jewish free men. But such rationalization also is not faithful to the Talmudic tradition, that the Talmudic rabbis, when faced with such problems, found technical, practical solutions. So in this case, they instituted, a rabbinic decree, instituted what's called the ketubah, marriage contract, so that the marriage, the ketubah provides, it's actually obligations of the man in the event of divorce, particularly financial obligations to take care of the woman. And this was actually, I think, an act of love and caring for the woman, that it's meant to be, that in the event of divorce, he could divorce her against her will. She was left in a precarious position, that is an act of love and caring. I think it was meant to be a way of taking care of the woman then, in the event of divorce. And by the way, today, the ketubah is no longer enforceable, but I think it still can symbolize this act of love and caring, although I think, personally, I think it should be updated and it should be mutual obligations that the husband and wife in the event of divorce are going to take care of each other as an act of love and caring. But in any case, regarding the ketubah, one other thing, parenthetically, our custom is today in the marriage ceremony, in the very middle of the ceremony, we have a custom, we read the ketubah, which I think reflects Judaism's very practical orientation. On this most joyful day, when the marriage of the couple, such a joyful day, we stop in the middle of a very joyous celebration and the ceremony. We stop it in the middle, and again, reflecting Judaism's very practical, pragmatic orientation, we stop in the middle and say, wait a minute, what happens here if there's going to be a divorce, if it's not going to work out? And we read the ketubah. Okay, so that's the first aspect, that the woman be divorced against her will. The second aspect is the man who initiates divorce, and he has to give the document, the divorce document called a get, he has to give it out of his free will. So that meant the man could, in initiating the divorce, the man could initiate a divorce for any reason whatsoever in Talmudic law, even reasons that are seeming without justifiable reason, any reason whatsoever. The woman in Talmudic law does not initiate the divorce, but already in the Talmudic period there were exceptions made, again by the Talmudic rabbis, when for very justifiable reasons the woman could initiate a divorce, such as if, let's say, the husband is abusing the wife, or the husband is sexually impotent and they can't have children. If there's some justifiable reason, then the rabbis made exception and the woman could initiate the divorce. But the problem here is, what if the husband withholds the divorce document? He has to give it out of his own free will. He has to initiate the divorce. So the woman then would be left in position that is called aguna in Hebrew, which means anchored. She's actually anchored to an unjust situation, that she can't be released from this marriage relationship and without the husband giving her the divorce document. And that means she can't marry again according to Jewish law. So again, the rabbis found practical solutions. And in the Orthodox world, widespread, modern Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox solutions that exist are not applied. And I think this is a terrible tragedy, that women end up in this unjust position of being anchored to an injustice of aguna. And I'll just mention two Talmudic sources that aren't applied today for whatever reasons, all kinds of rationalizations, but they're not applied. The first solution is that even though it requires the giving of the divorce document, requires that it be given out of free will on the part of the husband, the Talmudic rabbis, in a situation when the husband's refusing to give the divorce document, can coerce him, even beat him physically. Now, obviously that solution offends, I think, most peoples in our contemporary world, offends our contemporary moral sensibilities. And mine as well. Ideally, I'm not in favor of such a solution. However, what I will say is that if no other solutions are going to be applied that exist, and no other solutions are going to be applied, then in such a situation, if there's going to be all kinds of rationalization, why not to apply other solutions that exist, then apply this solution. Better that there should be an injustice committed against the husband, beat him, coerce him, than the injustice of the woman not being able to marry. So, but I'll give a second solution that I don't think offends contemporary moral sensibilities, and that is annul the marriage retroactively. So that, again, a marriage relationship assumes that both parties are entering in good faith. So if this husband is refusing to give the divorce document, that means that he didn't enter the relationship in good faith. So annul the marriage. What if there's children who were born out of this marriage? So the children with the marriage annulled, would be regarded as being born out of wedlock, but that has no practical implications in Judaism. There's no damage that will be done to the children from a legal point of view. So that's in terms of divorce. Okay, now the second issue that I want to deal with, where I think very clearly there's discrimination to the detriment of women, is the issue of women witnessing. Women are ineligible to witness in a Jewish court of law, rabbinic court. And so here I want to cite Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, who was a great Orthodox thinker and halachic legal scholar of the 20th century. You can read about him in Wikipedia. But he wrote an essay in Hebrew on the status of women in Judaism, and in that essay he deals with the issue of women being ineligible to witness in a Jewish court of law. And he argues, now notice he's functioning in this essay not as a halachic legal scholar, he's really functioning as a thinker, so he's really not expressing a legal opinion, he's expressing a philosophic viewpoint. But I very much identify with his philosophic viewpoint. And what he argues there regarding women being ineligible to witness in a Jewish court of law is, he says, there are two reasons given in the Talmudic literature. One is that the Talmudic ideal that the place of the woman is to be in the home, which Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz points out that there's a halachic legal expression of that ideal, that the woman shouldn't leave the home more than once or twice a month. And if that's the case, then she, of course, doesn't go to the court of law to witness. That's what stands behind the ineligibility of the woman to witness, is her place is to be in the home. She's not to leave the home more than once or twice a month. So, but what Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz argues is that in our day, in our a different social reality than that of the Talmud, women Even among ultra-Orthodox, in the ultra-Orthodox world, women leave the home far more than once or twice a month. Women oftentimes, even in the ultra-Orthodox world, work outside the home, and they're active in public, leaving the home more than once or twice a month. So that if that's the case, there's no reason that the law should apply, that she should be ineligible, at least according to that reason. If she can leave the home, then she can work outside the home, she can leave the home in public, then she can go to a court of law and witness. The second reason given is that the woman's testimony is not reliable because she's not intelligent enough. And now notice that also reflects a certain social reality. Actually, in the Talmudic period, the social reality was that women weren't intelligent. Not something an inherent problem with women, a social reality. Women weren't taught, they weren't educated. And that meant that from an intellectual point of view, they were on the level of small children. We don't rely on testimony of a small child as a witness. So too, a woman being uneducated like a child, you don't rely on her testimony. It made sense in the Talmudic world. But in our day, if somebody argues such a thing, women today study the same as men, education, in terms of Western education, mathematics, sciences, humanities. Women study the same as men. So anybody who argues that women aren't intelligent enough, we can't rely on their testimony today, Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz says that's a desecration of God, of Judaism. I absolutely agree with him. So once those two reasons fall, then the law really isn't applicable from a philosophic point of view. This is the argument of Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz. And I very much identify with that. I know, again, in the Orthodox world, there'll be rationalization that even if the reasons don't apply, the law nevertheless stands. And that's simply a recipe for not making changes. That's to relate to the law as some kind of an eternal form, like Plato's forms, Plato's ideals. Plato's ideas, the forms, like for example in the case of a chair, there's a perfect concept for Plato of a chair, a concept, an idea that's eternal and unchanging. And all chairs in our reality are imperfect reflections of that perfect concept of a chair. So that makes the law to be like an eternal, unchanging concept. And that's not faithful to the Talmudic tradition. The Talmudic law is situational, that every law depends on the situation. You always have a question, does it apply in general, the law? Does it apply in a particular situation? Which particular situations does it apply? Does it apply in this situation, not that situation? How do we apply it in a particular situation? All of that depends, among other things, on reasons. So that I think that I very much identify with Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz's argument that once the reasons fall for the ineligibility of women to witness, then she should be eligible to witness in our day. So I'll stop here in this video, then, and in the next video I'll continue in talking about the status of women in Judaism.